She was just 18 years old when she was forced to marry a 45-year-old millionaire. On their wedding night, what should have been a moment of surrender became silence and a gaze that exposed an old wound. He believed he was in control, but something about her awakened a ghost he had buried. If you love romance stories, watch until the end. You won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. New York City pulsed below, a giant heart of concrete and ambition. From the 43rd floor of the most imposing commercial building on Park Avenue, the city looked like a chessboard where Magnus Dorian Callan moved the pieces with the precision of a born predator. At 32, he had built a financial empire that sent tremors through the stock markets on 3 continents. His name was whispered in boardrooms from London to Tokyo, always accompanied by a mixture of admiration and fear. His office occupied the entire floor. Floor-to-ceiling tempered glass offered a panoramic view of the metropolis, but Magnus rarely looked out. His grey eyes, the colour of polished steel, were always fixed on contracts, charts, numbers that danced across the multiple screens adorning his rosewood desk. He didn't smile. There was no reason to. Smiling was a display of weakness, and weakness was something Magnus Dorian Callan had torn from himself, with the same brutality one uses to dig a bullet from a body. The previous assistant had lasted only 6 months. Before her, none made it past a year. They arrived confident, beautiful, and competent women, drawn by the promise of working alongside the most powerful man. In the American financial market, they left with their nerves in shreds, some with anxiety attacks, others simply disappearing in the middle of the night, leaving only hastily scribbled resignation letters behind. Magnus didn't care. Assistants were replaceable parts in his perfect money-making machine, until the human resources firm, already desperate, hired Aurora Hayes. She appeared on a rainy Monday in March, carrying a worn leather briefcase and an umbrella that dripped onto the polished marble of the lobby. She came from Stone Creek, a small town in upstate New York, where the mountains touch the sky and everyone knows. Everyone. At 26, Aurora had the quiet beauty of small-town women, brown hair always tied in a flawless bun, honey-colored eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, and a posture that mixed shyness with a silent dignity that intrigued anyone who watched her closely. She didn't wear high heels like the others. Her flat shoes made an almost imperceptible sound in the hallway, as if she were trying not to disturb even the air around her. Her clothes were simple, well-cut, but without ostentation. Long-sleeved blouses, knee-length skirts, neutral colors that made her seem like an elegant shadow walking through the glass-walled corridors of Callan Investments. On the first day, Magnus called her in at 9 in the morning to explain his routine. Aurora entered his office with a notebook in hand and her eyes downcast, as if she feared a direct look might set her on fire. He spoke for 15 minutes without stopping, listing his demands with the coldness of someone reading an instruction manual. Coffee always at 7:30, black, no sugar. Meetings scheduled at least a week in advance. Personal calls filtered. In truth, he didn't receive personal calls because he had no personal life. When he finished, he waited for the usual questions about lunch breaks, leave policies, benefits. Aurora just said, "Understood, Mr. Callan." Her voice was low, melodic, with a faint upstate accent that sounded like music amid the city's metallic din. He dismissed her with a gesture and returned to his reports. He didn't see her leave. He didn't see her settle at the desk outside his office. He didn't see her methodically organize every document, every schedule, every detail of his corporate life with an almost religious care. But he noticed her. In the following days, Magnus began to realize that something had changed. His appointments flowed smoothly. His coffee arrived at the exact temperature. Important documents appeared on his desk before he even asked for them. Aurora made no mistakes. She didn't forget messages. She didn't try to make small talk. She simply existed, like an efficient extension of his own mind, and that irritated him deeply. Magnus was used to women who tried to impress him, assistants who wore slightly lower necklines, who laughed too loudly at his dry jokes, who found excuses to enter his office and show him some report that could have perfectly been sent by email. Aurora did the opposite. She seemed determined to be invisible. During meetings, she sat in a corner, taking notes in a delicate and precise hand. When someone asked something, she answered with exact information, without embellishments. When Magnus called her for a task, she listened in silence and executed everything perfectly. She never questioned, never suggested, never showed any opinion about the business that passed through her hands. It was as if she were a competent ghost, and Magnus began to wonder what lay behind that carefully controlled facade. He was a man accustomed to deciphering people as if they were financial codes. He knew when an executive was lying just by the way they moved their hands. He could predict which investors would back down by observing how they breathed during presentations. But Aurora was an enigma that left him intrigued and, strangely, unsettled. She was never late, but she never arrived too early either. She never left before her time, but never stayed longer than necessary. She had lunch alone at a small cafe on the corner, always with a book. She didn't wear strong perfumes. She didn't talk about her personal life. It was as if she had built a professional persona so perfect that it had erased any trace of humanity. And then, on a particularly frustrating afternoon in April, everything changed. Magnus had just left a tense meeting with Japanese investors. The negotiation had gone well, but he hated when people tried to test him, play games, question his decisions. It was moments like those that reminded him why he had emotionally shielded himself. Trust was a currency that depreciated too quickly in that world. Instead of going directly back to his office, he decided to walk through the company's corridors. It was something he did. From time to time, not out of genuine interest in the employees, but because he liked to keep everyone in a constant state of alert. His unexpected presence on the lower floors always generated a discreet flurry of activity. People straightening their backs, pretending to be busy, checking if everything was in order. It was while passing near the small kitchenette on the executive floor that he heard it. Aurora's voice, low but clear, speaking on the phone. She must have thought she was alone because she spoke with an intimacy Magnus had never perceived in her. "I know you. Think it's weird, Leanne, but it's the truth. I'm still a virgin." Magnus stopped immediately, not because he intended to eavesdrop, but because the confession was so unexpected, so raw, that it hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood still in the hallway, hidden behind a marble column, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine curiosity about another person. "It's not because of religion." "No," Aurora continued, and there was a sadness in her voice that made each word sound like a painful confession. "Not for morals or things like that. It's out of fear, you know? And because deep down no one has ever really looked at me, I'm like a shadow. People pass by me and don't even notice I exist." There was a pause. Magnus could hear his own breathing, which had become faster. There was something in the vulnerability of that confession that unsettled him inside, as if someone had moved the furniture in a dark room. "It's no different here in New York," Aurora went on. "I work for the most powerful man I've ever met, and to him, I'm just an employee. Not good, not bad, just useful. And maybe it's better this way. Men like him destroy women like me, not out of malice, but because it's what they do, it's their nature." There was a bitter wisdom in those words that made Magnus feel something close to discomfort. She spoke of him as if she knew him, as if she had deciphered his essence in just a few months of work, and there was a resignation in her voice that bothered him more than it should have. "I have to go, my friend. He could be back any minute, and if he sees me here on the phone, well, you know how bosses are." Magnus heard her footsteps moving away. He stood there for a few more minutes, leaning against the cold column, trying to process what he had heard. It wasn't just the revelation about her virginity that had shaken him. It was the way she spoke of herself as if she were truly invisible. It was the sadness in her voice when she mentioned that no one had ever really looked at her. And it was the way she had described him. Men like him destroy women like her. Was that how he was seen? How he? A predator who consumed and discarded people. Magnus had never cared about others' opinions of his personality, but something in Aurora's observation hit him differently. Perhaps because she hadn't spoken with anger or resentment. She had spoken like someone stating a scientific fact, a law of nature. When he returned to his office, Aurora was at her desk, typing some report with the same concentration as always. She looked up when she saw him, a quick, discreet movement. "Mr. Callan, you have a call from the London brokerage in 5 minutes. Shall I transfer it to your direct line?" "Transfer? Get," he replied, but his voice came out different, hoarser, as if his vocal cords had rusted. Aurora nodded and went back to work. Magnus entered his office and closed the door, but he couldn't concentrate on the call from London. He stood watching Aurora through the glass wall that separated his office from the outer area. She worked with a mechanical efficiency, but every now and then she would stop, look out the window, and sigh in a way that seemed to carry the weight of the world. For the first time in years, Magnus Dorian Callan felt curious about someone, and this curiosity was accompanied by something more dangerous: desire. Not just physical desire, although that was also present, but a desire to understand, to unravel, to possess not just the body, but the secrets of this woman who considered herself invisible. He didn't know yet that Aurora held secrets about him that would change everything. He didn't know that she wasn't there by chance, that there were hidden motives behind her seemingly perfect application for the job. He didn't know that while he watched her like a predator watching its prey, she was also watching him, but with the eyes of someone carrying an old guilt and a debt that needed to be paid. What Magnus did know was that, for the first time in a long time, a woman had awakened something in him besides boredom or irritation. Aurora Hayes, with her studied shyness and her well-kept secrets, had become a mystery he intended to solve. And like every mystery in Magnus Dorian Callan's life, this one too would be solved through control, manipulation, and power. He just didn't imagine that, this time, the game would be different. That Aurora wasn't just prey waiting to be hunted, that she also had her own weapons, her own plans, her own reasons for being there. The silent war between them was just beginning. And in this war, the only casualties would be the masks they both wore to hide who they really were. As the New York afternoon dissolved into shades of orange and red through the skyscraper's windows, Magnus allowed himself a small discovery. For the first time in years, he was truly interested in someone. It was a dangerous, obsessive interest, one that promised complications he couldn't yet calculate. But Magnus Dorian Callan was a man who turned complications into opportunities, and Aurora Hayes had just become his next conquest without even knowing it. The problem was that conquests sometimes conquer back. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamic between Magnus and Aurora. He began to pay attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed: the way she lightly touched her hair when she was nervous, the way her eyes darted away when he looked at her directly, the breath that quickened almost imperceptibly when he got too close to her desk. Magnus was an expert at reading people, but Aurora remained a fascinating enigma. During meetings, he started observing her more closely. He noticed she had opinions. Her eyes would narrow slightly when someone said something particularly stupid. Her brows would furrow almost imperceptibly when the numbers didn't add up. But she never spoke up. It was as if she had trained herself to be a silent spectator of her own life. It was on a Thursday that Magnus decided to break this pattern. He was in a video conference with investors from Hong Kong when he noticed an error in the presented data. A subtle error, one most people would miss, but which could cost millions if not corrected. He interrupted the presentation and looked at Aurora. "Miss Hayes, please verify the numbers in the spreadsheet for the third quarter of last year." Aurora looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. "Sir? The numbers are incorrect. Correct them so we can proceed." There was a tense silence in the room. The executives present exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was unusual for Magnus to ask an assistant to make corrections during an important meeting. Aurora hesitated for a moment, but then opened her laptop and began to work. She found the error in less than 2 minutes. Not only did she find it, but she identified the source of the problem and presented a clear and concise solution. She spoke with confidence, using precise technical terms, demonstrating a knowledge of finance that no one expected from her. Magnus felt something akin to satisfaction. He had tested Aurora, and she had passed brilliantly. More than that, she had revealed an intelligence hidden behind that facade of submission. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. Excellent work." The compliment made Aurora blush slightly. She lowered her eyes and murmured an almost inaudible, "Thank you." But Magnus saw the small smile she tried to hide. It was a genuine smile, one that completely transformed her face and revealed a beauty he hadn't noticed before. After the meeting, he called her into his office. "Where did you study finance?" Aurora seemed nervous, standing before his desk with her hands clasped. "I got my degree in business administration in Albany, Mr. Callan, and I took some online specialization courses." "Why didn't you mention this in the interview?" "It wasn't asked. And the position is for an assistant, not an analyst." Magnus stood up and walked to the window. Below, New York was buzzing with late afternoon traffic. "You're underestimated, Miss Hayes." "Sir." He turned to look at her. Aurora was even more tense, as if expecting a trap. "You have the potential for much more than organizing my schedule." "I like what I do." "I don't believe that." Magnus walked towards her, stopping at a distance that was respectful yet intimidating. "You're too smart to be content with being invisible." "I'm not invisible," Aurora replied, but her voice betrayed her insecurity. "You are, and you know it." He tilted his head, studying her face. "The question is, why did you choose to be?" Aurora opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Magnus could see the internal struggle in her eyes, the desire to defend herself, battling the fear of exposing too much. "You may go," he said, moving back behind his desk. "But think about what I said." Aurora left the room quickly, as if she were fleeing. Magnus watched her through the glass wall. She sat at her desk and remained still for a few minutes, staring at her own hands. There was a vulnerability in her posture that made Magnus feel a strange pang in his chest. Something between guilt and desire. From that day on, he began to include her more in meetings. He asked for her opinion on reports, requested that she verify data, invented reasons to keep her close. Aurora responded with growing competence, but always with that caution that made her seem like a frightened animal ready to bolt. Magnus knew he was playing a dangerous game. He was testing her limits, pushing her out of the comfort zone she had so carefully constructed, but there was something addictive in the way she reacted. The mix of fear and fascination in her eyes, the way she struggled to maintain her professional composure, while he systematically dismantled her defenses. It was on a Friday afternoon that the game changed levels. Magnus had dismissed Aurora early, saying he had some private calls to make. She tidied her desk with her usual care and said goodbye with a polite, "Good evening, Mr. Callan." He replied without looking up from his documents, but watched as she walked to the elevator. Then, instead of making those private calls, he decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He left the office and walked through the city. New York, at night, had a different energy. The lights of the buildings created an urban mosaic of ambitions and dreams, the bars filled with executives decompressing from the day's stress, the streets teemed with a chaotic mix of haste and desperation. Magnus rarely allowed himself to be part of this collective humanity. His life was shielded, controlled, predictable. But that night, he found himself wandering aimlessly through the downtown streets, watching people, trying to understand what it was about him that made Aurora consider him a natural predator. That's when he saw her. Aurora was sitting alone in a small cafe. In the East Village, a book open before her and a steaming cup of tea between her hands. She had let her hair down, which fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and she wore a simple cotton blouse that made her look younger, more approachable. There was something almost romantic about the scene, a beautiful woman reading alone in a candle-lit cafe, completely absorbed in her own world. Magnus stood on the sidewalk, watching her through the window. There was a tranquility about Aurora that he never saw in the office. She read with total concentration, occasionally turning a page or bringing the cup to her lips. It was as if, away from the corporate environment, she allowed herself to truly exist. He entered the cafe. Aurora looked up as his shadow fell across her table. The surprise on her face was genuine, quickly followed by something that looked like panic. She instinctively closed the book, as if hiding something forbidden. "Mr. Callan, I wasn't expecting... May I sit down?" She nodded, still clearly uncomfortable. Magnus pulled out the chair opposite her and sat, noticing how she tensed at his proximity. "What are you reading?" Aurora looked at the book in her hands as if she had forgotten it existed. It's It's about behavioral psychology, nothing very interesting. Magnus held out his hand. May I see? She hesitated before handing over the book. It was a dense work on psychological manipulation and power dynamics in professional relationships. Magnus flipped through a few pages and noticed markings in the margins, notes made in a small, precise hand. Interesting choice of reading, he commented, returning the book. It's to better understand the work environment, Aurora said quickly, putting the book in her bag. And what have you discovered? She looked at him directly for the first time since he had sat down. There was something different in her eyes, an intensity that contrasted with her usual shyness. I've discovered that some people use power as a way to compensate for vulnerabilities they can't face. The observation was made in a neutral, almost academic tone, but Magnus felt the impact like a direct hit. She was analyzing him, studying him, trying to decipher him with the same dedication he devoted to her. And what else? He asked, genuinely curious. That the most dangerous people are those who have learned to see relationships as chess games. They move the pieces without considering that each piece is a human being with their own feelings and motivations. There was a tense silence between them. Magnus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. And you think I'm one of those people? Aurora held his gaze for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. I think, Mr. Callan, that you are far more complicated than you want to appear. The answer was more honest than he had expected. There was a quiet courage in her that surprised him. Aurora wasn't just being submissive or polite. She was being real. And you? Magnus asked. Are you playing chess too? Something flickered across Aurora's face, a shadow of guilt, fear. She lowered her eyes and picked up her teacup with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. I don't know how to play chess, Mr. Callan. But there was something in the way she said it that made Magnus suspect she was lying. Not about not knowing how to play chess, but about something bigger, something more important. There were secrets in that answer, layers of meaning he couldn't yet decipher. Call me Magnus, he said. We're outside the office. Aurora looked up again, surprised. That wouldn't be appropriate. Why not? Because it keeps things clear, simple, uncomplicated. Magnus smiled for the first time in a long while, a genuine smile, not one of the calculated ones he used in negotiations. Are you afraid of complications? I'm afraid of many things, Aurora answered with a disarming honesty. They looked at each other for a few seconds. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that went far beyond a casual conversation between a boss and an employee. Magnus could feel he was about to cross a line, to enter dangerous territory. May I walk you home? Aurora shook her head. Thank you, but that's not necessary, and it wouldn't be appropriate. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and left a few coins on the table to pay the bill. Magnus remained seated, watching as she walked away. At the cafe door, Aurora turned one last time. Mr. Callan? Yes? Some complications can't be undone. It's good to remember that. And then she left, leaving Magnus alone with a cold cup of coffee and the certainty that he had started something he wouldn't know how to finish. When he got home, a minimalist and cold apartment on the Upper East Side, Magnus realized he couldn't stop thinking about Aurora, about the way she had held the book, protecting it as if it held personal secrets, about the way her eyes had shone when she spoke of relationships as chess games, about the sadness that showed through when she said she was afraid of many things. There was something about Aurora Hayes that went far beyond the surface, something he needed to discover, even if it meant revealing parts of himself that he had buried long ago. The problem was that Magnus didn't know that. Aurora already knew those hidden parts of him, that she held secrets about his past that could destroy everything he had built, that her presence at Callan Investments was no coincidence, but part of a much more complex story that was just beginning to unfold. While he planned his next move in the game of seduction and control he thought he was commanding, Aurora was in her small apartment in the East Village, writing in a private journal reflections that would reveal, to any keen observer, that she too was an experienced player. The difference was that Aurora played not for power or control, but for redemption. and players motivated by guilt are always more dangerous than those motivated by desire alone. Monday arrived laden with an electric tension that seemed to permeate the entire 43rd floor of Callan Investments. Magnus arrived earlier than usual, at 7 in the morning, and found Aurora already at her desk, organizing documents with her usual meticulous precision. She greeted him with a polite, "Good morning, Mr. Callan," but there was something different in her eyes, a new caution, as if their conversation at the cafe had changed something fundamental between them. Throughout the morning, Magnus found himself watching her more than he should. The way she lightly bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, the way her hands moved over the keyboard, long, delicate fingers that made him imagine things he shouldn't be imagining about an employee. At 10:30, Thomas Ashford arrived. Magnus hadn't seen him in over 2 years. Thomas had been his best friend in childhood and adolescence, practically a brother, until life took them down different paths. While Magnus built a financial empire with the coldness of a war machine, Thomas had followed a more humanistic path, working with social projects and NGOs before returning to the corporate world as a partner in a sustainable consulting firm. The meeting had been scheduled for weeks. Thomas wanted to propose a partnership to finance renewable energy projects in the American Southwest. It was the kind of investment Magnus normally despised, too risky, not profitable enough in the short term, full of humanitarian variables that complicated purely financial calculations. But there was something in his and Thomas's past that made Magnus consider proposals he would normally reject without a second thought. Perhaps it was the memory of the times when they were just two, lost boys in a strict boarding school, protecting each other from bullies and lonely nights far from home. Thomas entered Magnus's office with that warm smile that hadn't changed since adolescence. He was a handsome man in an uncomplicated way that completely contrasted with Magnus's calculated elegance. Slightly messy brown hair, green eyes that shone with genuine joy, well-cut clothes but without ostentation. He radiated the quiet confidence of people who have made peace with themselves. "Magnus, man, you look exactly the same, just more serious if that's even possible." They embraced with the familiarity of those who share old stories and shared traumas. Magnus felt a strange pang in his chest, something like nostalgia, but mixed with a melancholy he had learned to suppress. "Thomas, how are things in the land of lost causes?" "They're good. Actually, better than I expected. And you? Conquered the world yet, or are you saving a few companies for next year?" It was a joke, but there was a careful observation in Thomas's tone. He was studying Magnus, trying to understand what kind of man his childhood friend had become. "There are still a few countries left," Magnus replied with the dry humor he used to keep people at a distance. They sat at the meeting table. Magnus noticed that Thomas glanced briefly at Aurora through the glass wall. It was just a quick look, almost imperceptible, but there was something in it that Magnus couldn't decipher. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Thomas presented impressive numbers on the growth of the solar energy market, return projections that were conservative but solid, and an implementation schedule that showed a deep understanding of the bureaucratic and logistical complexities of projects in rural America. It was a well-founded, intelligent, socially relevant, and financially viable proposal. Magnus should have said yes immediately. It was exactly the kind of diversification his company needed. But something made him hesitate, an indefinable feeling that accepting this project would be opening a door he had kept closed for many years. "I need to analyze the numbers more carefully," he finally said. "My team will study the proposal, and I'll give you an answer next week." Thomas nodded, but Magnus saw the disappointment in his eyes. "Of course. I understand." As they gathered their documents, Thomas asked the question Magnus had been dreading. "And your personal life? Married, kids, any special girlfriend?" "No." "I don't want to talk about it, Thomas." There was a firmness in Magnus's voice that made Thomas back down. They knew each other too well for Thomas not to realize there were wounds there that hadn't fully healed. "All right, but know that if you ever need to talk, I'm here, like I've always been." After Thomas left, Magnus remained alone in his office, staring at the documents scattered on the table. The proposal was good. Thomas was reliable. But there was something about the situation that made him uncomfortable, as if accepting this project would be admitting that a part of him missed the humanity he had discarded in the name of success. It was then that Aurora knocked on the door and entered with a strange expression on her face. "Mr. Callan, I need to speak with you about something." Magnus looked up from the documents. There was an unusual agitation in Aurora, as if she were wrestling with a difficult decision. "What is it?" "It's about Mr. Ashford, Thomas Ashford." Magnus felt something cold form in his stomach. "What about him?" Aurora closed the door and approached the desk, but remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her in a posture that mixed determination and nervousness. "I know him." "What do you mean?" "We studied together at St. Augustine's Academy in Albany a long time ago." Magnus leaned back in his chair, trying to process the information. St. Augustine's was an expensive, traditional institution. Aurora had mentioned she came from a small town. The pieces didn't fit. "You studied at a private school in Albany?" "I won a full academic scholarship." Aurora hesitated before continuing. "Thomas and I were close. Friends. Very good friends." There was something in the way she said, "very good friends," that made Magnus feel a pang of irrational jealousy. How close? He was the first person who really saw me, who treated me like I mattered. At the school, most of the students came from wealthy families. I was the poor scholarship kid who didn't fit in. Thomas was kind to me when no one else was. Magnus stood up and walked to the window, turning his back to Aurora. Below, New York pulsed on, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding in the mirrored skyscrapers. "And you kept in touch?" "No. After we finished high school, we lost contact. I went back to Stone Creek. He went to study abroad. We never spoke again. Until today." Until today. Magnus turned to face her. "And you didn't think it was important to tell me this before?" There was an accusation in his voice that made Aurora retreat slightly. "I didn't think it was relevant, and I didn't know how you would react." "How I would react to what?" Aurora opened her mouth to answer, but the words seemed to get lost somewhere between her mind and her voice. There was something more. Magnus could feel it, something she wasn't telling him yet. "Aurora." It was the first time he had called her by her first name, and the effect was immediate. She stiffened as if she'd received an electric shock. "What aren't you telling me?" She looked at him with those honey-colored eyes that seemed to carry ancient secrets. For a moment, Magnus thought she would confess everything, whatever it was. But then she shook her head. "Nothing, Mr. Callan. I just thought you should know that Thomas and I know each other." Magnus walked towards her, stopping at a distance that was professionally appropriate but forced Aurora to tilt her, head back to meet his eyes. It was a subtle psychological move, using his height and proximity to create a sense of vulnerability. "You're lying." "I'm not." "You are. And you know I hate lies." Aurora held his gaze with a courage Magnus didn't expect. "Some truths are more dangerous than lies, Mr. Callan." "For whom?" "For everyone involved." There was an intensity to the conversation that went far beyond a discussion about professional transparency. Magnus could feel they were dancing around something much bigger, some truth Aurora was guarding as if it were a bomb about to explode. He took another step closer. Aurora didn't back away, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing quickened. There was fear there, but also something else, something that looked like anticipation. "Aurora," he said again, and this time his voice was lower, more intimate. "What are you hiding from me?" For a moment, she seemed about to give in. Her eyes filled with tears she fought to hold back, and Magnus saw a vulnerability so raw that he felt the urge to touch her, to protect her from whatever was causing her this pain. But then Aurora composed herself, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a step back. "May I return to my work, Mr. Callan? I have several reports to finish." Magnus wanted to say no. He wanted to press her, until she told him everything, until there were no more secrets between them. But there was something in her posture, a wounded dignity, a silent strength that made him hesitate. "You may go." Aurora walked to the door, but stopped with her hand on the knob. "Mr. Callan." "Yes?" "Some people carry secrets not to hurt others, but to protect them. You should consider that before you judge." And then she left, leaving Magnus alone with more questions than answers. For the rest of the afternoon, he couldn't concentrate on anything. He watched Aurora through the glass wall, trying to decipher the mysteries she hid behind her impeccable professional efficiency. There was something about the connection between Aurora and Thomas that bothered him deeply. Not just jealousy, but a feeling that he was losing a game whose rules he didn't know. At 6 in the evening, Magnus made an impulsive decision. Instead of waiting until the following week, he called Thomas. "I want to accept your proposal," he said when Thomas answered, "but on one condition, which is, I want you to work directly with me on the project, here at the company, for at least 3 months. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Magnus, that's unexpected. I have my own company to run. Your partners can take over temporarily. That's the condition. Take it or leave it." Another pause. "May I ask why?" Magnus looked at Aurora, who was tidying her desk to leave. "Let's just say I want to be sure I'm making the right investment." What he didn't say was that he wanted to observe the dynamic between Aurora and Thomas up close. He wanted to understand what kind of history they shared and why she was so reluctant to talk about it. "All right," Thomas finally said, "I accept." After hanging up, Magnus leaned back in his chair and watched Aurora get into the elevator. There was something in the way she walked, determined, yet carrying an invisible weight, that made him want to unravel all her secrets. What he didn't know was that by bringing Thomas back into his life, he was opening a Pandora's box. That would reveal truths that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about himself and about the woman who had become his obsession. Aurora held secrets about him. Thomas knew secrets about her. And when these truths came to light, none of the three would emerge unscathed. The silent war that had begun between Magnus and Aurora was about to gain a new player. And in wars with 3 participants, alliances can change at any moment, turning allies into enemies and enemies into something far more dangerous. As Magnus planned his next moves, Aurora was at home, looking at an old photograph kept in a secret drawer. In the photo, 2 teenagers smiled at the camera, a shy girl with her hair tied back and a boy with green eyes who radiated kindness. It was a relic from a time when she believed in happy endings and in men who didn't use power to destroy women like her. What the photograph didn't show was the 3rd teenager in the story, the one who, years later, would become Magnus Dorian Callan, the man she had come to destroy, but who now threatened to destroy her first in ways she had never imagined possible. Thomas started working at Callan Investments on a rainy Monday in May. Magnus had prepared an office for him on the same floor, strategically positioned where he could observe the interactions between his old friend and Aurora. From the very first morning, it was clear there was a much more complex history between them than Aurora had revealed. When Thomas saw Aurora, his reaction was immediate and intense. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, as if he had seen a ghost, and murmured something Magnus couldn't hear. Aurora, for her part, turned visibly. Pale, her hands trembled slightly as she went to greet him, and her first words were a "Hello, Thomas," so laden with emotion that Magnus felt a pang of jealousy that surprised him with its intensity. Over the next few days, Magnus watched the careful dance between them. Thomas attempted casual conversations that Aurora politely deflected. She avoided being alone with him, always finding excuses to leave when Magnus wasn't present. There was a tension between them that went far beyond old friends who had lost touch. It was the tension of people who had shared something deep and painful. It was on a Thursday afternoon that Magnus decided to force the situation. He was in a meeting when he saw, through the glass wall, Thomas approach Aurora's desk. This time, instead of accepting her evasive answers, Thomas pulled up a chair and sat beside her. The conversation that followed was intense, though conducted in low voices that Magnus couldn't hear. He saw Aurora shake her head vigorously, as if denying something. He saw Thomas gently take her hand, a gesture she allowed for only a few seconds before pulling away. He saw tears in Aurora's eyes and an expression of deep pain on Thomas's face. When the meeting ended, Magnus left the room with a cold determination burning in his chest. It was time to find out the truth, whatever the cost. Aurora was alone at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen without really working. Magnus could see she was shaken. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she was breathing with the irregularity of someone fighting back tears. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "I need to speak with you now." Aurora followed him into his office without protest. Magnus closed the door and activated the soundproofing system he rarely used. Whatever was about to happen in there would be private. "Sit down." Aurora obeyed but maintained an erect posture, as if preparing for battle. "What is the history between you and Thomas?" "I already explained." "No, you lied." Magnus walked to the window, but this time he turned immediately to face her. "You weren't just friends. What happened between you?" Aurora closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for a confession she didn't want to make. When she opened them, there was a resignation there that Magnus hadn't expected. "We were dating during our last year of high school." The answer hit Magnus like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the revelation of a romantic relationship between them, but the way Aurora said it, with a pain that was still raw even after all these years. And I did something terrible, something that hurt him deeply." Aurora looked down at her hands. "And now he wants forgiveness that I don't know if I deserve." Magnus felt anger rising inside him, an irrational, possessive anger that scared him with its intensity. "What kind of terrible thing?" Aurora looked up to meet his eyes. There was a raw vulnerability in her expression that made Magnus want to simultaneously protect her and destroy her. "I cheated on him." The words came out like a whispered confession, heavy with a guilt Aurora had carried for years. Magnus felt something cold form in his stomach. "How?" "There was another boy at the school, Magnus Callan, 3 years older, from a very wealthy and influential family. He was different, dangerous, magnetic." Aurora paused, as if reliving painful memories. "I was in love with Thomas, but Magnus fascinated me in a way I couldn't explain. It was as if he saw parts of me that even I didn't know existed." Magnus's world stopped. The name Aurora had mentioned was his. She was talking about him, about the teenager he had been, from the darkest period of his life. But that was impossible. He would have remembered her. "Magnus Callan?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You know him?" It was an innocent question, but Magnus felt as if he had fallen into an abyss. Aurora didn't know. She hadn't made the connection between the troubled teenager she had known years ago and the powerful man she now worked for. "I know the name," he said carefully. Aurora nodded, lost in her own memories. He was fascinating and destructive at the same time. There was an anger in him, a pain that made him irresistible to an insecure girl like me. And one day at a party we kissed. Thomas saw us. Magnus remembered that kiss. He remembered the shy, brown-haired girl who had looked at him with a mixture of fascination and fear. He remembered how, back then, he used his pain as a weapon to hurt others. But he hadn't recognized Aurora. The years had changed her, refined her beauty, matured her features. "And what happened next?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Thomas never spoke to me again. He ended everything that night, in front of everyone. He said I had chosen to get involved with someone who destroyed everything he touched, and that he didn't want to be destroyed too." Tears began to stream down Aurora's face. He was right. Magnus Callan was toxic. 2 weeks later, he had a psychotic break at school, assaulted 3 students and was expelled. We later heard that he had attempted suicide. Magnus felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. Aurora was here, working for him, carrying the guilt for an episode that had almost completely destroyed him. She didn't know that the man sitting across from her was the same disturbed boy who had ruined her life years ago. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, fighting to maintain his composure. Because Thomas thinks I came to work here because of him. Because he thinks it's too much of a coincidence that he's here at the same time as me." Aurora wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "But the truth is different. I didn't come here for Thomas." "Then why?" Aurora looked directly into Magnus's eyes, and he saw a determination that had been hidden beneath all that carefully constructed submission. "Because I found out who Magnus Dorian Callan is. I found out he didn't die, as everyone thought. I found out he reinvented himself, changed his name, built an empire. And I came here because—" She hesitated, as if the next words were the hardest of her life. "Because I wanted to ask for forgiveness." The silence that followed was deafening. Magnus was processing the revelation that Aurora knew who he was, that she had come to work for him motivated by guilt. But there was something else in her confession, something that didn't fit. "How did you find out?" he asked. "By chance. 2 years ago, I saw a picture of you in a business magazine. You were different, obviously, older, more mature, more controlled. But I recognized your eyes, those grey eyes that seemed to carry all the pain in the world." Magnus stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Below, New York carried on its frantic pace, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on the 43rd floor. He needed time to process everything. The revelation that Aurora had recognized him, that she had come to work for him out of guilt, that she had carried the weight of that night for all these years. "You planned all this," he said without turning around. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Her honesty was brutal. "Why?" "Because I destroyed 2 people's lives that night. Thomas lost his faith in humanity. You almost died. And I learned to hate myself in a way I could never completely overcome." Magnus turned to face her. Aurora was crying silently, but her posture remained erect, dignified even in the confession of her mistakes. "And what did you hope to achieve by coming to work for me?" "I didn't know. Maybe just the chance to get to know the man you've become, to see if you were okay, if you had found peace, and maybe—" She hesitated again. "Maybe the chance to ask for forgiveness if you ever found out who I am." Magnus felt a complex mix of emotions, anger at being deceived, fascination with the complexity of Aurora's motives, and something that felt dangerously like relief. Someone finally knew the whole truth about him, about who he had been and who he had become. "And now?" he asked. "Now that you've confessed everything?" Aurora stood up, wiping her tears. "Now I apologize for lying about who I was, for coming to work here with hidden motives, for contributing to your pain all those years ago." She paused. "And then I'll leave." "No." The word came out with a firmness that surprised them both. Aurora looked at him in confusion. "No," she repeated. Magnus walked over to her, stopping just inches away. He could smell the soft perfume she wore, see the tears still glistening on her eyelashes, watch the way her breath quickened as he drew near. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. "Not until we resolve this completely." "Resolve what?" "Us. What we are now. What we've always been." Aurora shook her head. "Magnus, we're nothing. I'm just a woman who made a terrible mistake years ago, and you—" "And I'm the man who fell in love with that woman without knowing who she really was." The confession slipped out before Magnus could stop it. Aurora's eyes widened as if she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "You— what?" Magnus touched her face gently, as if she were made of glass. Aurora didn't pull away, but he could feel the tremor in her skin. "You fascinate me, Aurora, from the very first day. Your hidden intelligence, your strength disguised as fragility, the way you carry your secrets like precious jewels." He gently ran his thumb over her cheekbone. "I fell in love with the woman you are now, not the girl you were." "Magnus, this is crazy. You don't really know me. Don't I? Then tell me, why are you still a virgin, Aurora?" The question was asked in a low, intimate voice, and Aurora blushed intensely. That's not... It's because you've never allowed yourself to be truly seen by anyone after that night. It's because you decided you didn't deserve to be loved. It's because you turned guilt into an armor that prevents anyone from getting close to your heart. Aurora was crying again, but these were different tears now, tears of recognition, of someone who had been seen and understood for the first time in years. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I ruined your life. You saved my life." "How?" Magnus leaned his forehead against hers, an intimate gesture that made Aurora close her eyes. "Because that night, when you kissed me, it was the first time in years anyone had touched me with tenderness instead of fear or pity. For a few seconds, I remembered what it was like to be just a boy, not a monster created by narcissistic parents and schools that punished vulnerability. Magnus, the breakdown I had afterward wasn't because of you, Aurora. It was because I realized I had sabotaged the only good thing that had happened to me in years. You didn't destroy me. You showed me there was still something in me worth saving." They stayed like that for a few moments, foreheads touching, breaths mingling, years of pain and misunderstanding slowly dissolving between them. Aurora opened her eyes, and Magnus saw a vulnerability she had hidden for so long. "And now," she asked, "what do we do with all this?" Magnus smiled for the first time in weeks, a genuine smile, free from the mask he wore in the corporate world. "Now we start over. No lies, no secrets, no guilt, just Magnus and Aurora discovering who they can be together." Aurora hesitated. "And Thomas? Thomas will have to understand that some stories get second chances." She nodded slowly, as if accepting a new reality she couldn't yet fully process. Magnus moved back slightly, but didn't take his hands from her face. "But there's one condition," he said. "What is it?" "No more secrets between us. If we're going to try this, it has to be with total honesty." Aurora bit her lower lip, a gesture Magnus was learning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. There's one more thing you need to know." "What?" She took a deep breath, as if preparing to take a leap in the dark. "Thomas isn't here just because of the solar energy project. He's here because he's worried about me, because he thinks you're dangerous, that you're going to hurt me." Aurora paused. "He came to protect me from you." Magnus felt the familiar anger rise in his chest, but this time he managed to control it. Thomas was trying to protect Aurora based on what he knew about the disturbed teenager Magnus had been. It was, in a way, understandable. "And you? Do you need to be protected from me?" Aurora looked him in the eyes with an intensity that disarmed him. "I don't know yet. You are dangerous, Magnus, especially to me, but not in the way Thomas imagines." "What do you mean?" "You're dangerous because you make me want things I've learned not to desire. You make me want to be seen, to be touched, to be loved." She blushed as she said the last word. "And that terrifies me." Magnus felt something warm in his chest, something that had been cold for so long he had forgotten what it felt like. "Aurora," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "May I kiss you?" She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing all the implications, all the risks, all the possibilities of destruction that kiss could bring. Then, slowly, she nodded. The kiss was unlike anything Magnus had ever experienced. It wasn't the calculated, predatory kiss he used to dominate. It was hesitant, gentle, filled with years of pain transformed into tenderness. Aurora responded shyly, as if learning a new language, a new way of existing. When they parted, they were both breathing unevenly. Aurora touched her own lips with her fingers, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. "This changes everything," she whispered. "Yes," Magnus agreed, "it does." And as they stood there, looking at each other in the silence of the soundproofed office, neither of them could imagine that Thomas had witnessed the kiss through the glass wall, and that his reaction would be far more intense than either of them could predict. The truth had finally come to light. But the truth, as they would soon discover, can be both liberating and destructive. The storm arrived in the form of Thomas Ashford banging on Magnus's office door with a force that made the reinforced glass vibrate. It was Monday morning, 3 days after the kiss, and Aurora was still processing the seismic shifts that moment had caused in her carefully controlled life. She and Magnus had spent the weekend talking on the phone, long, hesitant conversations where they both navigated the new reality of knowing each other's truths. But now Thomas was here, and his expression was that of someone who had made an irreversible decision. "We need to talk," he said, entering the room without waiting for permission. His green eyes, normally warm, were as cold as ice. "The three of us. Now." Magnus was sitting behind his desk, but rose slowly at the tension on his friend's face. Aurora, who was organizing documents outside, heard Thomas's tone and felt her stomach clench with a sense of foreboding. "Thomas," Magnus said carefully, "if this is about the project—" "It's not about the damn project, Magnus. It's about what I saw on Friday." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Aurora appeared at the office door, pale, already knowing the moment she had feared had finally arrived. "Come in and close the door, Aurora," Thomas said without taking his eyes off Magnus. "It's time for all the cards to be on the table." Aurora obeyed, feeling as if she were walking to her own trial. Magnus activated the room's soundproofing system again, but this time the gesture felt more like a preparation for war than for a private conversation. "I saw you kissing," Thomas said bluntly. "And all weekend I've been trying to figure out how the hell we got to this point." "Thomas, let me explain," Aurora began, but he raised a hand to stop her. "No, Aurora. This time you're going to listen to me." He turned to her, with an intensity that made her shrink back. "I spent the last few days investigating. I found some interesting things about your arrival here, about the very convenient coincidences that brought you to work for Magnus Dorian Callan, of all people." Aurora felt the blood run cold in her veins. "What did you find?" "I found out you knew exactly who he was before you came to work here. I found out you researched everything about him, about the company, about his routine." Thomas walked towards her, and there was a deep pain in his eyes. "I found out that 2 years ago you started obsessively following everything about Magnus. Articles, interviews, public appearances. You know his life better than he does." Magnus looked at Aurora with an expression of confusion and growing suspicion. "Aurora, what is he talking about?" She couldn't speak. She had been caught in a lie she didn't even know she was telling. Yes, she had investigated Magnus. Yes, she had meticulously prepared for this encounter, but not for the reasons Thomas was suggesting. "Tell him, Aurora," Thomas pressed. "Tell him about the newspaper clippings you keep at home, about how you know the names of all the company's former executives, every merger he's made, every detail of his personal life you could dig up." "Thomas, stop," Aurora whispered, but he was relentless. "Tell him about the book, Aurora." Magnus stiffened. "What book?" Thomas looked directly into Magnus's eyes. "Aurora is writing a book about you, Magnus, about your transformation, your life, your business. She has hundreds of pages already written." Aurora's world collapsed. Yes, she was writing about Magnus, but not in the way Thomas was suggesting. It was a way to process her own guilt, to understand how a troubled boy had become the powerful man he was now. It was therapy, not exploitation, but in the eyes of Magnus, who had just discovered he had been deceived again, it looked exactly like what Thomas was insinuating, calculated manipulation. "Is it true?" Magnus asked, his voice back to that icy tone Aurora had learned to fear. "Yes, but it's not. Is it true or not?" "It's true." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Magnus's heavy breathing. Aurora could see the transformation happening. The man who had opened up to her in recent days disappearing, replaced by the cold, calculating mask he wore as armor. "How much?" "What? How much is the publisher paying you for the book?" Aurora felt as if she had been slapped. "Magnus, there is no publisher. I'm not selling anything. It's personal. It's a lie." The word came out like a blade. "Everything has been a lie from day one." Thomas approached Magnus, a bitter satisfaction on his face. "Now you see why I came here. She's using you, Magnus, just like she used me years ago." "Thomas, no!" Aurora stood up, desperate. "You're twisting everything." Am I? Then explain the hundreds of photos you have of him, Aurora. Explain why you know details of his personal life that even I don't know. Explain why you calculated every move to get here. Magnus walked to the window, turning his back on them both. Aurora could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched into fists. When he spoke, his voice was too controlled, a sign of a rage being held back with difficulty. Get out of my company, Aurora. Magnus, please, let me explain. Get out! The shout echoed through the soundproofed room, making Aurora recoil as if she had been physically struck. There was a raw pain in Magnus's voice that went far beyond anger. It was the pain of someone who had allowed himself to be vulnerable, only to discover he had been betrayed again. Aurora looked at Thomas, a mixture of pleading and hatred in her eyes. How could you do this? How could you twist everything like this? Because, Thomas said with a calmness that contrasted with the emotional storm in the air, I'm not going to let you destroy someone else I love. Not again. The confession that Thomas still loved her after all these years might have been touching under other circumstances, but at that moment it sounded like a death sentence for any chance she and Magnus might have had. Thomas, Magnus said, still looking out the window, you can leave too. Our deal is off. Magnus, leave. Thomas hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more. But then he looked at Aurora one last time, a look that mixed protection, remorse, and an unshakable determination, and left the room. Aurora was left alone with Magnus, but an ocean might as well have separated them. He remained with his back to her, and Aurora could see the way his shoulders trembled slightly, as if he were fighting something much deeper than anger. Magnus, she said softly, please, let me explain the truth. The truth. He turned slowly, and what Aurora saw in his eyes made her take a step back. It wasn't anger. It was a pain so deep it seemed to be consuming him from within. Which version of the truth, Aurora? The one where you came here out of guilt? The one where you're writing a book about me? The one where you obsessively investigated me for 2 years? They're all true, but not the way Thomas told it. It doesn't matter how. Magnus walked towards her, but this time his proximity brought no intimacy. It brought a threat. What matters is that you lied. From the very first day, you lied about who you were, about why you were here, about everything. I didn't lie about my feelings, Aurora said desperately. I didn't lie about what I feel for you. Magnus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitterness. Feelings? You don't even know what your feelings are, Aurora. Everything you've done was based on guilt, obsession, and now we find out. Personal gain. There's no personal gain. The book isn't going to be published. It's just what? Therapy? A way to process your guilt at my expense? Aurora felt tears begin to fall, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. It's a way to understand how someone can survive so much pain and transform into something so majestic. The words slipped out without her thinking, and Magnus stopped moving. For a moment his mask slipped, and Aurora saw a vulnerability that almost made her run to him. Majestic. You've become something incredible, Magnus. Despite everything you've suffered, all the pain, you've built something extraordinary. And I wanted to understand how. I wanted to understand if there was hope for someone like me, too. Magnus was silent for a long moment, and Aurora thought she might have reached him. But then he shook his head. No, I'm not falling for that again. You're too good with words, Aurora, too good at making people believe in romanticized versions of the truth. He walked to the door and opened it. Get your things and leave. I don't want to see you here again. Aurora didn't move. And if I refuse, then I'll call security. The coldness in his voice was absolute. Aurora realized she had lost, not just Magnus, but any chance of redemption she thought she might find here. She walked to the door but stopped beside him. Magnus didn't look at her, keeping his eyes fixed on some point in the hallway. Magnus, she said quietly, I know you don't believe me now, but someday, when the pain passes, I want you to know that I fell in love with you. Not the troubled boy you were, not the powerful billionaire you are, but the man I saw when you let your guard down for a few moments." She paused, waiting for a reaction. There was none. "And I want you to know that, regardless of what Thomas said, I would never do anything to hurt you again. Ever." Aurora left the office and went to her desk to collect her things. The other employees pretended not to watch, but she could feel the curious glances, the discreet whispers. In 15 minutes, she had packed years of dreams and hopes into a small cardboard box. When she passed Magnus's office for the last time, he was sitting, behind his desk, staring at documents he clearly wasn't reading. Aurora paused for a moment, hoping he would look up, that he would give her one last chance. He didn't. Aurora walked out of Callan Investments without looking back, carrying not just her personal belongings, but the weight of having lost the only person who had ever truly seen her. Magnus was left alone in his office, surrounded by the silence that had been his constant companion for so many years. He should have felt relieved to have discovered the truth before it was too late. He should have felt satisfied to have cut Aurora out of his life, before she could hurt him more deeply. But all he felt was an emptiness that seemed larger than all the voids he had experienced before. Because this time, it wasn't just the pain of betrayal. It was the pain of losing the only person who had made his life feel less cold, less calculated, less empty. And the pain of suspecting that maybe, just maybe, he had made the biggest mistake of his life. 3 months later, Aurora published a book. The title was Never Truly Seen, and it was a poetic narrative about a woman who had learned to be invisible and a man who used power as armor against intimacy. It was about guilt, redemption, and the way the past can both destroy and save us. The book didn't mention real names. It contained no details that could identify specific people. It was fiction based on universal truths about pain and transformation, and it became an immediate success. Magnus read every word. He recognized himself on every page, not as an exploited character, but as a human being seen with compassion and understanding. Aurora had written about him the way she had said she saw him, as something majestic that had emerged from pain. It was then that he began to understand that he might have made the biggest mistake of his life. But understanding and having the courage to correct it were very different things. And Magnus Dorian Callan, for all his wealth and power, discovered that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to admit you were wrong. 8 months had passed since Aurora had left Callan Investments, and Magnus had discovered that financial success was an even colder companion when you knew the alternative. Aurora's book had become a literary phenomenon, translated into 17 languages, a topic of discussion at universities and an object of analysis on television shows. She had become a respected public figure, an eloquent voice on trauma, transformation, and the strength that can emerge from vulnerability. Magnus followed everything from a distance. He read every interview she gave, watched every television appearance, bought multiple editions of the book, as if he were an obsessive collector of his own story, told through the eyes of the one who had loved him. Every word Aurora wrote about the male protagonist, about his strength, his complexity, his wounded beauty, was both a balm and a torture, because she never described him as a villain. Even in fiction, even disguised in metaphors and allegories, she painted him as a man who deserved to be loved. And Magnus began to understand that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The realization came gradually, like a dawn that breaks slowly until suddenly the whole sky is golden. First, it was the way Aurora never mentioned his real name in interviews, even when investigative journalists tried to discover who had inspired the story. She protected his identity with a loyalty he didn't deserve. Then it was discovering that Aurora had refused million-dollar offers from foreign publishers who wanted more detailed versions of the story. She kept the narrative at a universal level, protecting the specific details that could expose him. Finally, it was Thomas who brought him the full truth. They met in a discreet bar in Greenwich Village on a rainy New York night. Thomas had called after months of no contact, saying only, "We need to talk about Aurora, and about what I did." Magnus almost refused. After the confrontation at the company, they had only exchanged formal messages resolving contractual issues. The decades-long friendship had become another casualty of the emotional war Aurora had unwittingly started. But there was something in Thomas's tone that intrigued him. A humility, perhaps even remorse, that contrasted with the unshakable determination he had shown months before. "I lied, Magnus," Thomas said as soon as they sat down. There were no preambles, no attempts to soften the blow. "About Aurora, about her motivations. I twisted everything." Magnus felt something cold form in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "The book she was writing. It wasn't for publication. It was personal notes, a way for her to process everything that had happened. It only became a book after you fired her." Thomas stirred the whiskey in his glass, avoiding Magnus's gaze. "And the photos, the newspaper clippings?" "I exaggerated. She had a few things, yes, but it wasn't the obsession I suggested." "Why did you lie?" Thomas finally looked into Magnus's eyes, and there was a pain there that went far beyond remorse. "Because I was still in love with her. After all these years, after everything that happened, I still believed she was mine. And when I saw you two together," he shook his head, "when I saw the way she looked at you, I knew I had lost any chance I might have had." The silence between them was filled by the sound of rain on the window and the distant murmur of other conversations. Magnus was processing the revelation, trying to reconstruct that terrible day through the lens of the truth. "She knew who you were, yes," Thomas continued, "but not for the reasons I suggested. Aurora. Aurora always blamed herself for what happened to you in high school. When she found out you had survived, that you had become what you became, she saw it as a miracle, and she wanted to be a part of it somehow. And you destroyed everything." "I destroyed everything." Thomas downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp. "And the irony is, by trying to protect her from you, I hurt her more than you ever could have." Magnus stood up abruptly. The revelation was too much to process sitting in a noisy bar. He needed air, space, time to understand the dimensions of the mistake he had made. "Magnus," Thomas called out as he reached the door, "she loves you, for real. And you love her too, don't you?" Magnus didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the answer. Over the following weeks, Magnus immersed himself in an obsessive investigation of Aurora, but this time he wasn't looking for evidence of betrayal. He was looking for the woman he had let slip away. He discovered she had moved to a small house in the Berkshires, surrounded by mountains and silence. He discovered she donated most of the book's profits to NGOs that worked with victims of psychological abuse. He discovered she had never given interviews speaking ill of him, even when journalists tried to provoke her with questions about toxic relationships. And he discovered that she was alone. Completely, utterly alone. It was on a Saturday morning, almost a year after their separation, that Magnus made the decision that would change everything. He cancelled all his appointments, turned off his phone, and drove out of New York City towards the mountains. He found Aurora in a small cafe in the central square of a quaint town. She was sitting alone at an outdoor table, a laptop open and a steaming cup of coffee beside it. She wore simple clothes, a blue cotton blouse and faded jeans, and there was a tranquility in her posture that Magnus didn't remember seeing before. She looked up as his shadow fell across the table, and Magnus saw the shock quickly turn to caution. "Magnus," she said, her voice calmer than he expected, "what are you doing here?" He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, uninvited. Aurora instinctively closed her laptop, a protective gesture that reminded him of how careful she had been with her secrets. "I came to apologize." Aurora studied his face for a long moment. Magnus could see she was weighing his motives, trying to figure out if it was safe to let her guard down. "Apologize for what?" "For not believing you, for letting fear and paranoia speak louder than my feelings, for being a complete idiot." A small smile touched Aurora's lips. "That's quite specific. Thomas told me the truth, about how he twisted everything, about your real motives." The smile vanished, replaced by a more serious expression. "And you believe him now?" "I read your book, Aurora. Every version in every language I could find. I read every interview you gave, watched every public appearance." Magnus leaned. forward, resting his elbows on the table. "And I realized that the way you write about him isn't the way someone writes about a person they want to exploit." "What do you mean?" "You write about him like someone who loves him, like someone who sees beauty where others see only power, like someone who understands that behind the armor is a man who deserves to be saved." Aurora looked down at her hands. "Maybe that's because it's what I've always seen. Even after everything I did, after how I treated you." She looked up again, and Magnus saw an honesty that disarmed him. "Especially after that, because you reacted exactly as I expected you to. You protected yourself the only way you knew how. And that makes you... what? Pity me? It makes me love you even more." The words came out simply, directly, without drama or hesitation. Aurora said them as if they were a scientific fact, something as basic as the law of gravity. Magnus felt something break in his chest, not from pain, but from relief, like a dam that finally gives way and lets the water flow freely. "Aurora," he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. "Can you forgive me?" "For what?" "For being an idiot, for hurting you, for throwing away the best thing that ever happened to me." Aurora was silent for a moment, studying his face. Magnus could see she was fighting something, perhaps the fear of letting herself believe him again. "There are conditions," she finally said. "What are they?" "First, no more secrets. If we're going to try again, it has to be with total transparency from both sides." "Accepted." "Second, I'm not changing who I am to fit into your life. I'm not going back to being the invisible assistant hiding behind a desk. I don't want you to change. I want the woman who writes books, who talks about trauma and transformation, who had the courage to love me when I didn't deserve it." Aurora smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "And third, you're going to let me teach you how to play the piano again." Magnus's eyes widened. "How do you know about the piano?" "Because after you fired me, I went looking for your story, the real story, not the edited version the world knows. And I found out you played the piano as a child before everything went wrong. I found out you gave it up after the incident." Magnus felt a strange emotion rise in his chest. Aurora had cared enough to uncover the parts of him that he himself had forgotten to value. "Why the piano?" "Because I want to see you do something beautiful that doesn't involve money or power. I want to see your hands create music instead of contracts. I want to see you reconnect with the part of you that still believes in beauty." Magnus reached his hand across the table. Aurora looked at it for a moment before lacing her fingers with his. "What if I'm too rusty? What if my hands can't create anything beautiful anymore?" Aurora squeezed his hand gently. "Then I'll teach you again, as many times as it takes." They stayed like that for a moment, hands clasped on the table of a small cafe in the Berkshires, surrounded by mountains and the promise of new beginnings. "Aurora," Magnus said, "may I kiss you?" She nodded, and this time there was no hesitation, no fear. When their lips touched, it was as if all the months of separation dissolved into pure gratitude. It was the kiss of two people who had been lost and found, who had been broken and allowed themselves to be rebuilt. When they parted, Aurora touched his face gently. "Welcome back, Magnus Dorian Callan." "Thank you for waiting for me, Aurora Hayes." 6 months later, Aurora moved back to New York, but not back to corporate life. She continued to write, became a respected voice on mental health and relationships, and gave talks on how to turn trauma into strength. Magnus learned to play the piano again. His hands, which for years had known only the hardness of business, rediscovered the softness of the keys. Aurora was right. There was something therapeutic in creating beauty instead of just accumulating power. They married in a small ceremony with only the people who truly mattered. Thomas was there, reconciled with both of them, and served as Magnus's best man. On the plaque announcing their union, Magnus insisted it read, "Magnus Callan and Aurora Hayes, two people who learned that to love someone is to see them completely and choose to stay anyway." During their honeymoon in a house on the coast of Maine, Aurora finally gave Magnus the notebooks where She had written about him all those years. They weren't hundreds of pages, as Thomas had suggested, but they were revealing in a different way. Each entry showed a woman trying to understand not only the man he had become, but the wounded boy who still existed beneath all that armor. "You really saw me," Magnus said after reading it all, "from the very beginning." "I saw someone who was trying to survive the only way he knew how," Aurora replied, lying beside him in bed, the sea breeze drifting through the open window. "And who deserved to be loved, despite all his defenses. And now?" Aurora turned to look into his eyes. "Now I see a man who is learning that he can lower those defenses without being destroyed, that he can be vulnerable and still be strong." Magnus kissed her slowly, savoring the certainty that he had finally found someone who saw him not as a project to be fixed or a prize to be won, but as a complex, imperfect human being who deserved to be loved exactly as he was. "I love you, Aurora," he murmured against her lips. "I love you for seeing something in me that I had forgotten existed. I love you because you taught me that it's possible to reinvent yourself without losing the essence of who you are, and because you make me want to be seen, even when it scares me." They made love for the first time that night, with the patience of those who have their whole lives ahead of them and the intensity of those who almost lost everything. Aurora was no longer a virgin just in body. It was the first time she had given herself completely, without fear, without reservation, without the shield of invisibility she had worn for so long. Magnus, for his part, made love for the first time in his life as an act of surrender, not conquest. Every touch was a declaration, every kiss a promise that she would always be seen, always valued, always loved. 2 years later, when Aurora released her second book, a story about second chances and the transformative power of forgiveness, the dedication simply read, "For Magnus, who taught me that some happy endings are worth all the pain in the middle." And in an interview, when a journalist asked if she believed in soulmates, Aurora smiled and said, "I believe in people who choose to see each other completely and decide to stay. That's rarer and more valuable than any destiny." Magnus watched the interview from his renovated office at Callan Investments, where a grand piano now sat next to his work desk, and photos of Aurora were scattered among the financial reports. He had found a balance between the ruthless businessman and the man who was allowed to love and be loved. When Aurora came home that night, she found Magnus playing a song he had composed for her, a melancholy melody that spoke of loss and reunion, of second chances and loves that survived the storm. She sat beside him on the piano bench and rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the music his hands created. It was the sound of redemption, of healing, of two wounded hearts that had chosen to heal together. "What would you name this song?" Aurora asked when he finished. Magnus looked at her, at the woman who had seen his shattered soul and chosen to love it anyway, and smiled. "The one who was always seen." Because now, finally, Magnus knew what it was like to be truly seen. And Aurora had learned that she deserved to be loved, not in spite of her imperfections, but because of the unique way she loved. They had found, in each other, not the completeness that fairy tales promise, but something far more valuable, the certainty that they had chosen the right love, the right person at the right time in their lives to truly begin to live.